So in July of 1966, I met Jim Brooker. I married Jim Brooker. And he was born and bred in Waynesboro, Virginia, Shenandoah Valley. Went to the University of Richmond. And he loved me. And before we got married, I told him, of course he knew I'm American Indian because I told him, and he could see, and he loved that. But I tried to prepare him for the fact that not everybody was going to be real happy with the fact that 6'3" white boy had married 5'2" brown girl. And he's like, oh, Lena, you've got to be kidding. I'm like, no, I'm not kidding. And so I went up, his aunts or somebody were going to give me a bridal shower. And this was like right after school ended in June. Went up to Waynesboro, which is what, a town of maybe 20,000. And so his dad's family had a lot of branches to it there. His mother was born in England and an only child, and they lived in Rhode Island. And then they opened some kind of big factory, a cloth factory in Waynesboro, and he came down as the manager of that. So at that point, of course, Virginia schools were still very much segregated. At any rate, we're having the shower. And in come, just a gaggle of females for the shower. And I had not met any of them before I, of course, met his mother and his sister. So we're all sitting around getting organized for the activities to start. And the matriarch of the Brooker family comes in. And I've heard stories about her before, right? Country, farm. I'm like, okay. So she comes in and they introduce me to her. She's, sitting in her chair and I'm over here. And she looks at me and she says, Lena, I have a question for you. And I'm like, okay. And she said, I know that they said you are Indian, American Indian. I'm like, yes, ma'am. She said, do you have any black blood in you? And I'm like, huh. So I just looked at her and I said, you know what? I said, I am not aware of black lineage in my history. But I said, honestly, I suspect there is. I said, the same with you and everybody, that if we go back far enough, that we all have black blood in us. Thud. And everybody just sort of sitting there, and so finally somebody said, oh, I think it's time for refreshments. I didn't tell Jim about that for a long time because he would have gone to the matriarch and whatever. And she's not going to change her mind. She was asking a question. But then in August, after we got married, I was so excited about being married and getting a driver's license with my new married name and all that. So while Jim was working, I went to the DMV with my North Carolina driver's license in hand, and it was a pretty big office, and walked up, didn't have to wait, and told the man that I wanted a new driver's license. I was a new resident and newly married, and I handed him my license. And back then, they had your picture and your race on the driver's license. So he said, okay, and you didn't have to take any test, or, he was just going to do it. And he came back and he handed me my license. And I looked at it, and he said, is it okay? And I said, I'm sorry, it isn't. And he said, what do you mean it isn't? And I said, well, you have my race wrong. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, American. I said, first of all, you have C. And he said, well, what's wrong with that? And I said, did you not see what's on mine? I said, mine says American Indian. And he said, we don't have American Indians in the state of Virginia. And I'm like, well, that can't be true, because I said, I have relatives who live in the state of Virginia. He said, well, I don't know what you've got, but Virginia does not and has not had Indians since about 1924. And he said, I didn't make up the damn rule. He said, that's the way it is. Of course, getting louder as he speaks. And I said, well, I don't know what the state of Virginia's got. I said, but you've got an Indian now. And I want my race on here correctly. Didn't I just tell you? And of course, by now, everybody's, and I'm like, what are you doing, Lena? He said, I told you. I said, well, I know what you told me, but I said, I can't go with that. I said, because my birth certificate says I'm an American Indian. And that's what my mom and daddy told me. And that's how I've lived. And this is what this says. And that's what I want on my driver's license. And he just looked, red face. I said, and I don't want to have to do this, but I said, if you won't put this on my driver's license, I guess I'll have to see you in court. And he jerked up my little license and went slamming back over to where you did whatever you did. And it wasn't long before he came down and he took it and slammed it on the counter, and he said, well, does this make you happy? And I picked it up and looked, and I'm like, oh God. And I said, no, it doesn't. And he said, well, what's wrong now? And I said, nobody in the whole Indian world ever spells American Indian with lowercase letters. Ever. And I said, so they need to be capitalized. Oh, God, he just flew off the handle. And I'm just standing going, oh, what are you doing? So I said, so this is your choice. You give me my correct driver's license, or I'll see you in court. He took that thing up and he went over there and he did it something, and he came back down and he said, well, this is it. And he'd done it. And I'm standing there all of a sudden shaking in my boots, because it dawned on me that my driver's license had my new address on it. he knew exactly where I lived. He could notify his clan buddies or anybody else he wanted to, and we would never know who it was. I'm thinking this on the way out to the car, shaking. And so the DMV was like on one side of town from where our apartment was, and I could hardly drive. I was so scared, just thinking about what might happen, because I insisted that he got my driver's license right. And I questioned his statements about no Indians being in Virginia. And it wasn't until many years later that Jim and I were back in Waynesboro, and we stopped at a state park not far from there that he'd gone to as a child to go camping. And he wanted to go in, to see what it was like. And they had a visitor center. And like what you're doing, it had information about different attractions in the area, the people in the area. And there was one about Indians in Virginia. And, it was like a nice book. So I bought it. And as Jim's driving, I'm reading. And I get to the section on the 1920s. And Walter Plecker got the law passed, and just with a signature, there are no Indians in the state of Virginia. And so the guy was right, technically. And then that made me think of the fact that when I was in college, my dad seemed to be making a lot of trips up to see his parents. And he stopped, and I went with him one weekend. He stopped at Meredith, and I went with him. And I said, Dad, what are you doing coming up here so much? And he said, I'm doing research. I've got to find some stuff about records for your grandparents. And I didn't know, okay. So later, and I still surmise that they were to the point where they were eligible for welfare or some benefits because they were poor at a certain age, and that it required a birth certificate, and that when he found them, that they were marked as colored, and that he then tried, I don't know if it was successful or not, to get that changed. But I do know that as recently as last summer, I was in High Plains, and something came up about the number of Sappony people who live in the Richmond area, and how a lot of them moved up there after high school, and went to work. And that one woman I know, when she was born in the Richmond area, her birth certificate has C on it, and how embarrassed she is that it's on there, and that she rarely tells anybody about that. And so I was telling my friend who was telling me, I said, well, she can have it changed. Now, it would take a load off her shoulders, because it has troubled her since she was a child, and she's 60 now. Just how, one other thing that is has been for many people a not so subtle way of denigrating our heritage. And that I think a part of our writing books and having panel discussions, it's why talking about the past is that you can learn from it about what your ancestors went through and hopefully learn something that will absolve the pain of some wrong acts and also teach us, well, what not to do in the future. Because Indian people are not free from prejudice against other people. And I've always found it just really interesting that some of us continue to talk about other groups and treat other groups as we were, and it caused us pain. And I hope we get past that. I think that some of your work will help with that. So then we were married for several years that were party years, single, and Jim had an offer to go out to Northwest Ohio, which was an hour from anywhere, hour from Fort Wayne, an hour and a half to Toledo. And they set up a new manufacturing facility for travel trailers. And Jim did sales and insurance for that company. And it was there that Laura was born. And much to her chagrin, she was not born in North Carolina. And much to my chagrin, the first year we were out there, I was introduced to what really frigid weather was like. I had thought Virginia was cold. That's a whole nother cold. And so the little town closest to where the factory was called Edgerton. And when I told my dad it was Edgerton, Ohio, he a couple of days later called me and he says, "Well, now I see why it's called Edgerton." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He said, "It's at the edge of the earth. It's out in the middle of nowhere." And I said, "Yes, it's cornfields." I said, if it weren't so far away and if it weren't cold in winter, you would think it could be Robeson County. Anyway, when we moved to the Edgerton area, we rented a house. It was such a tiny town, smaller than St. Paul's. All the available houses for rent in town were taken up by the executive team. We were one of the last to go. So we rented a great big farmhouse out in the midst of cornfields, about 2 miles out. And there was a lot of entertaining, to welcome the new industry to town. And doctor, chiropractors, undertaker, lawyer. And so I met a number of really nice people as soon as we got there. And I was at one of them's home later. And she said, "Lena, how have people treated you since you've been here?" And I said, "Well, friendly, friendly, nice." And she said, "Well, don't be fooled by all this." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, before I met y'all, before we had a big party," she said, "I went to the post office and greeted the postmaster. And she said, he said, Karen, have you met the people with that new company? And she said, yes. And he said to her, do you know they have brought a nigger woman to town, and she's living here, and she's married to a white guy? And Karen said, I knew immediately that he was talking about you. And I said, oh, well, maybe that's why he stared so hard when I was in there the other day. And I just thought, mistakenly, that if you left the South, you left that behind. Maybe it's because it was in a little town. But I don't think so, because when we moved to the area, or moving in transit, all of our furniture and all was going to be, it was packed up and shipped out. And we had 2 cars, so we drove out. And the county seat, we were in Williams County, Ohio, and the county seat was Bryan. And that little town we were going to be closest to didn't have a hotel or a motel. So our first night there, we go to this town, we get a motel room, we go onto the town square, a lovely town square, like New England, with the trees and benches and the businesses all around. There were a couple of restaurants, and we found one and had a lovely dinner. And Sunday, we decided to go back into town and hope something was open, because there was nothing out where we were to eat. So here was a bar open, and we went in, and they had bar food, and we were talking to the guy while they were cooking. So I said to the guy, he said, are y'all new in town? And I just came in last night. And I said, we were downtown, and one of the things I noticed was I didn't see any black people. I mean, it was businesses all around. They were open. He said, no, and thank God you didn't. He said, the last time we had a black family here, he said, we managed to run them out. And I'm like, what kind of town have... We're not going to be living in this town? It's probably even worse in the country. But that was a big eye-opener for me, that, it wasn't just the South. So from there, we stayed a couple years, and Jim had a lot of success with his work there. And when Laura was growing up, but he traveled all the time, like for 3 weeks at a time. And then that was at the beginning of you probably don't remember this, there was a big gas and oil crisis, and they were selling travel trailers and motorhomes, and they were not doing well. So he had to make a, I don't know what you call it, a projection of how many would be sold and all that. And because it crashed, the gas and the oil, then nobody was buying. So they thought that maybe they should get a new sales manager. But not before he was paid a bonus that we could live on for a couple years to get out of that situation. And so we traveled. I knew where I wanted to relocate to. It was going to be North Carolina. But I agreed to travel to places in the Southeast, because that's where he wanted to come back to also. So we visited a couple places in Florida, Tallahassee, Ocala. We went to Richmond. He'd gone to school there. And we went to Raleigh, which I knew is where I wanted to go. And so we spent that summer with my parents. And it was a fun summer for Laura. She was the only grandchild. And no matter what Laura wanted, that was fine, including having a dog in the house, which my dad would have never let us have. And we found a house in North Raleigh that we liked. And then the guy, the owner, called Jim and wanted to do an under-the-table deal and cut the realtor out. And Jim says, you know, there's a lack of principle here. You signed up with this guy, so we didn't get that house. But we ended up living near Crabtree until for probably 5 years, 6, until I got pregnant with Lindsay. And we needed another bedroom. Not for the 4 of us, but to have a guest room. And so that's when we moved over to Fairview Road, and that's when I had left teaching. I taught 1 year in Raleigh at a 6th grade center. Nothing but 6th graders. And I had never taught 6th grade, knew I didn't want to teach 6th grade. The math was as hard for me as it was for the students. I told Jim after about 4 days, I said, I don't know if I'll make it to the end of the year. But I managed to. But what I also learned was that with as much energy as I expended teaching, then when I got home, I really didn't want to do children things. I had had my quota of children, and I knew that was bad. So I resigned at the end of the year and ended up getting a job at the commission. And that was a really good time for me, really good time. Owen Grove, I don't know if you probably don't remember him. He was, well, it was Mr. Early Maynor who was the director of the commission, the first director. Greg was there in some position, I think with the CETA program. Owen Grove was the director of that. And they had established field offices in Fayetteville area, Clinton, Greensboro, I think Waccamaw too, Hallowaz. The Maharans weren't part of it then. And I was hired to work with Owen in the CETA program, Comprehensive Employment Training Act, big federal dollars. And my specific assignments was to monitor the offices in Halifax and Greensboro, and then to do a survey in Wake County to see if we could determine how many Native Americans were there. And I enjoyed that. I met a lot of good people. And as a result, that's how I got involved really in advocacy for our people. I was in my office early on, and an Indian man came in and told me that he was a veteran, and that when he was drafted, and he worked with the utilities company, and that when he left, before he left, he was told that when he came back, his job would be waiting for him. And he said when he came back, and he notified them that there was always some reason why they didn't have a job for him. And he said, you know, it's not fair. They're discriminating against me. What can you do? What can I do? I didn't know that was part of my job description. But when I talked to Owen, he said, it's about employment. And he said, so, yeah, let's see what we can do for him. And I'm like, do you have any ideas? And he said, no, you'll think of something. So I called Southern Bell, it was, and asked to speak to their HR director. And I told them that I had who I was with, and that I had an Indian veteran who had concerns about not being rehired, and that I would like to come talk to them about that. And they said, okay. And so I went out, told them who I was there on behalf of. Could they explain what was going on? Well, these other people had more seniority, And I said, well, you know, what I would like to see is the dates of employment. When the Indian guy started, when he went to war, when he came back, and same with the other guy. And I said, and while you're at it, I would also like to see how many Native Americans you have hired in Raleigh and surrounding counties when they were hired. I mean, I'm just making this stuff up as I go. And because we have people who want to work, and I could be a source of referrals if we can work together. And so how soon can you have all this data together, and we'll have another meeting? And they said, 2 weeks. Well, fine. And what I realized at that moment was the best way to get a good response is to go in with a positive attitude. You don't threaten people right off. You go because you want to help somebody. And then you take it from there. Well, it took a while, but he got his job back. And I did. Their HR people would call me and say, we need a secretary or whatever. So then out of Robeson County, from Saddle Tree, we had a couple of people there who were really connected politically to the governor and lieutenant governor. And so he was the person who recommended me to Mr. Early to be hired. And I didn't know what the CETA program was. I told him that. And the receptionist said, it's a federal program. They'll train you what to do. And I'm like, okay. And so then I, of course, interviewed with Owen and was hired. And where I'm going with this, Robeson County, the person who recommended me, then is like, if anybody came to him looking for a job or referral, he would say, well, just call Lena. And I'm like, I don't have jobs. But over the course of a couple of years, because of investigating leads of what was happening or not happening, there was a lot of referrals that I made. So it was like an advocacy that was informal. Does that make sense? It was sort of, that's what it was. I had no power to hire. But the most interesting one of those was that because of my going to Greensboro all the time to chat with their office, to check their files, the people they serve, were they eligible? If not, you know, you have to correct that. And so they told me in the office when Daphne was there that Reynolds was doing something that had opportunities for employment. And there was also a big brewery that was coming to the area. So I made an appointment with R.J. Reynolds. And you know what was weird is if you told them you're with the Commission of Indian Affairs, I think they thought that was a offshoot of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They just knew it sounded official. And they all had to have compliance things. So anyway, I made this appointment at R.J. Reynolds. And, you know, they were very kind, set it up, told me what day and what time and what floor to come to. And this was in the old building. And I get there, guards, tell them where you want to go. And they even had a old-timey elevator with doorman in it. That's how old the building was. So he said, you're up on the whatever the top floor was. Okay. I thought I was meeting with one person. And I get off the elevator, and the doorman said, you know, you go to this door here. So I went in, a receptionist, and she took me to another room. And when she opened the doors, there was a table that would seat probably 30 people. And I'm like to myself, I don't need to be in a room this big. And the door opened, and in came a procession of maybe like 10 people. And I'm like, oh boy. And so it was the corporate council, the corporate HR people, just whatever. And so I realized I had a great opportunity to basically do the same thing as Southern Bell. And we had a nice meeting, talked about them finding out how many people they hired, da-da-da. And so the council said, well, I know we have tried to employ American Indians before, but they don't stay. And I said, well, I want to give you a little insight on that. And I said, most Indians live in rural communities or near small towns. This is like a big city. It's foreign. And I said, the other is, look around you. What looks like native culture here? I said, are people not comfortable here? And so in order to keep people here, it's not just about how much money you pay, but how you make them feel. and you can do things in the community and here. And as a result, later there were people hired, and some went, up. And I love doing that, and I've never done it in my life. But I think that it's part of that's the educational aspect that I love. And I will flash back to the summer when I had graduated from there. And I was getting ready to go to Charlotte to live. I got the contract. And it was about time for school in Robinson County to start. And it dawned on me that I would be moving away from home permanently. And it made me have mixed emotions. I was excited and I was sad. So I said to my dad, Dad, I'm feeling sort of weird about moving to Charlotte. And he said, why? And I said, well, I've watched you and Mom spend your whole life helping educate people in the hopes that it would mean a better life for them. You've done that your whole life. And I said, here I am getting ready to leave Robinson County and not doing anything for our people. And he said, oh, no, hold on. He said, you're wrong. And I said, well, tell me how I'm wrong. And he said, wherever you go, every person you meet, you have the opportunity to talk about our people. And he said, furthermore, everything you do is a story to those people about who we are. And he said, you never feel sorry for leaving. He said, wherever you go, you will be helping educate other people learn about our people. And he said, that's important. And boy, many years later, how prophetic those words were, because just because I've met so many people in both the private sector, the public sector. I've been training public, municipal, private, and it's always been about how to do better by all people, but particularly Indian people. So isn't that just sort of, it's a blessing in my life. And I'm really grateful for it. I started writing a book, stories, back in the 80s with the intention of it being a book for my children. Because I never talked to them about the painful things that I experienced and all that. I didn't want to jade them. I wanted them to learn about it when they were old enough. I mean, I would say, Mom, did you go to this movie theater when you were growing up? Mom, no. Or if we went, we had to sit upstairs. Why? That's stupid. Yeah, it was stupid. But I didn't go into the hardcore stuff. But I decided, I knew I wanted to do that. And then all of a sudden, Lindsay's married and got a baby, and I'm like, if you're ever going to get this done, you need to get it done. So I sent, I was very private about my writings, but I was not super confident about it. So I sent a draft of 2 stories to an Indian woman on the condition that she critiqued them and then let me know what her thought was. And I waited. And I finally got the package. And the first thing I pulled out looked like red ink all over it. And she said, you really need to improve your writing some. And I knew that. But she said, the more important question is, why are you writing this book? Why would anybody want to read this book? What's to gain from it? And I was crushed. This is somebody I had just admired. I mean, really admired. And I'm like, well, if that's the reaction of Indian people, then I've misinterpreted. And I sent it to a couple stories to a couple of North Carolina publishers. I thought if it's a North Carolina locale, that would be a good fit. And the response I got from the major publisher in North Carolina at the time was interesting stories, but can you liven them up a little bit? These are sort of all, they're sort of sad. And I'm like, to myself, this isn't fiction. So when I told him about all that, he said, whenever you're ready, he said, we'll just self-publish. But I put it down and I didn't touch it for about 10 years. I mean, I was just crushed. And one night, both my brothers were here. We're sitting at the dining room table. One of them said, how's that book coming along? No, that's not. It hasn't been for like about 10 years. And I go, what? And I told them about the woman and then the publisher. And one brother, they both got really quiet, and one brother said, I'm pretty sure I know why that woman had that reaction. And I'm like, all right. And he said, it has brought up old pain for her that she has not dealt with. And so she just doesn't want to deal with it. It's hidden, she's kept it buried. And he said, so you need to write the damn book. And I'm like, I don't know. But they kept on me. And so finally in 1991, I don't remember when this book was published. 2017. And I'm delighted. It's been very gratifying because so many people have said, I identify with your stories, Indian people. It's been educational for non-Indian people because they have no idea that's what it was like. It has been good now that my grandboys are big and my great niece, they know a part of me that even their mother didn't know at the same age. And I always try to make it such that we're not looking for pity, we're not looking for anything other than history that tells the truth. And that everybody's story can be slightly different or dramatically different. But the main themes of the story of discrimination and lack of opportunities because of skin color hurt Indian people financially, emotionally, and it hurt the economy of the places because, you know, everybody could have won. But it did change. And one of the things I found out while writing the book, researching, is I was looking up dates about the year we got married. And somebody asked me, like, when did loving happen? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm sure it was already done by the time we got married. Well, guess what? It wasn't. And I didn't know that. So I called the Robinson County Registrar's office. And I said, do you have a copy of my marriage certificate? Because what I figured had happened was that Jim had declared that he was Indian, just so there wouldn't be any issues. And she said, yes, I have one. And I said, can you look? And she said, he's put down as white and you're Indian, but the law didn't change until 1967. So I talked to a couple of Indian lawyers, of course they're younger. I talked to my family's attorney, Mr. Stacy, before he died. And he said he thought the explanation was that by that time people knew it was a stupid law. And that in many places they just ignored it, even though it was still on the books. And I asked him specifically if he'd ever had a client who came to him for counsel about that, and he said no. But yes, so this book was a love letter to my parents, to honor them for the way they had brought me up, taught me to adjust, taught me to face challenges with bright hopes and to never give up. And Jim helped me with that. He helped me by accepting me fully, but at the same time, he said to me, you have to learn to accept that because you do look different, people are going to look at you. But it's not necessarily because they think it's bad. They're just looking at you. And he said, so you need to let go of all fears of stares, that everybody's not going to ask you out. I mean, to leave the place. That went on for a long time. I was just afraid. But I rarely showed it. Does that make sense? I mean, you can just say, okay, I gotta do this. But the one time that I lost it on him about that, we haven't been married that long. We were going to see my parents in Saddle Tree, and we were traveling down 95, and we were in North Carolina. And so Jim said, I would like to stop and get a cup of coffee and a piece of pie. And I'm like, well, not out here, you don't. This was like what county is done in Sampson County? Harnett. It was right in that area, or right beyond it. It was at a truck stop. And I'm like, Jim, we don't stop at truck stops. And he said, well, we are. And I'm like, please don't stop at the truck stop. I said, if this is the one I'm thinking about, it still has a white only sign over the door. And so he pulled it in to the truck stop. And he said, I said, I'm not going in. And he said, oh yeah, we're going to go in together. And I've got you. And I'm like, Jim, if there are like 6 or 8 guys, they'll have us. Because the white only sign was over the door. He said, no, we're going in. I could have killed him. Why would you do this to me? So we go in, we sit down at a table. Nobody comes for a long time. And finally, this waitress comes over and asks, what would you like? Jim said, pie and coffee. I said, coffee. I thought I was going to throw up. I was so nervous. Everybody looking. So finally, I think Jim took 3 times the length of time to normally eat this piece of pie. And he said, are you ready to go? And I said, no, about 20 minutes ago. So we get out in the car. I don't speak to him for an hour. And when I do, I say all the kinds of bad things. And he said, but nothing happened. Nothing happened. He said, I can't guarantee that nothing will happen in every situation. But nothing happened this time. And that's what you need to start looking for. Because you're spending so much anxiety over worrying about what will. I said, well, if you thought you were going to be kicked out, I said, maybe you wouldn't worry because you're big. But I said, I know they could kick me out, or worse, if I'm by myself. And he said, well, of course he would say this, Lena, have you ever thought of the fact that you're a pretty woman and people might be looking at that? And I said, yeah, a pretty brown woman maybe, but he said, one step at a time. It took me a long time to get over that. And so then you fast forward and we're on Fairview Road and my Lindsay is like about 10 years old. And I'm working at the Women's Center. And the chair of the board of directors was married to the treasurer of the News and Observer. And in one of my interim jobs, I did decorating and did some decorating for them. At any rate, she was the board chair at the Women's Center. And to express her appreciation for the work we were doing, she invited the executive director and staff to have dinner at the Carolina Country Club. And I knew at that point they did not have a single person of color there. Well, they did. And I wrestled with that decision for a long time. I lived in a neighborhood where a lot of people belonged to the club. They were friendly. But, we didn't belong to that club. And I knew at that time we probably would have been blackballed. So one night, and my boss said, I know this is presenting some issues for you. You don't have to tell me that. She said, and you do not have to go. That's up to you, I understand. And she said, I'll talk to Nell. I'm like, just give me some time. So as the time came closer, we were at the dinner table and the topic came up. And my Lindsay, who as I said was about 10, said, Mommy, you need to go. And I said, and why do I need to go? And she said, because you've always told us somebody has to be the first. And this is maybe one of your first. And I could have just hit her. Because she was right. And she said, and if they're mean to you, you can always leave. But if they aren't, then you might enjoy yourself. And I'm like, have I said that so many times? So when we get there, sure enough, we're sitting in the lobby, and I see people walking by who I know from the neighborhood, and they're like, and so we go into the dining room, and it turns out to be a buffet night. And there are a lot of people there. And the buffet line sort of snakes around. And we're going through the line, and me just sort of looking around. And all of a sudden I hear this voice go, Lena Brooker, how are you? And I turned around, and it was our pediatrician. And he stood up and he said, I haven't seen you. Come on over here and give me a hug. Right there in the dining room with Raleigh's finest, all white. And so we chatted for a minute. And, I said, you better go get your food. Well, what's so interesting is that his son married a woman from Egypt. She's not as dark as I am, but she's not pale. And there was concern by some that she would not be accepted in the Raleigh community. But here's the deal. Watson Pugh, the pediatrician, and his wife are two of the wealthiest people in Raleigh. And they have belonged to the Carolina Country Club, I guess, since they got married. And nobody will tell Watson Pugh that his daughter-in-law can't come to the country club. They may talk about it, but, So when I get home, everybody's waiting, and I'm smiling. Yay! I say all that to say I've had a blessed life. I've had an interesting life. It has never been boring. I think that's partly because of God's plan for the opportunities that have been provided me. And I think another thing is that doing nothing doesn't become me. In other words, I can't just sit around and do nothing for very long. I like to be doing something productive or fun. And I've had many opportunities to do that. And I'm so grateful. So grateful for my parents. So grateful for Jim. So grateful for Reverend Finlater. The girls, the grandchildren, the spouses, because they have never tried to hold me back. They've always supported my endeavors. And I'm just and I've been blessed with good health. And I'm a blessed woman.
So I have a couple of questions to ask. And I know some of this you've already mentioned, but I just want to make sure I have it correct. You went to elementary, middle, and high school in Robeson County?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Lived on the school ground yard. And then when I guess when I was in college, was when my parents built their house across 301 from sort of at an angle from the school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what was your favorite subject in school?
History.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been fascinated with history and politics. And I learned to read off a Kellogg's cereal box and at a very early age. And my parents always subscribed to the Robesonian, and then on Sundays to the News and Observer. And then when we had the Carolina Indian Voice, we got that. And so my dad always said that you read the Robesonian to see what the local politics are about and who got killed. And you read the Indian Voice for the Pembroke Indian perspective. And then the News and Observer for the state objective perspective, particularly the legislature and politics. He always followed that. And I remember when, back in, I guess it was the 50s, whenever Jesse Helms was in Congress, he would watch this on the news. And of course, Jesse was just so wrong about race relations. And I said to him, Dad, why are you watching him? I mean, listen to what he's saying. And he said, Lena, it's always wise to know what the opposition is saying and what they're doing. It makes you better prepared. And I'm like, well, But from politics and history, after school, a lot of times when I was like in the 4th and 5th grade, when we had a new building that had a beautiful library, and Mary Martin Bell, well, Rosemarie Lowry's mother was, do you know Rosemarie Lowry?
Mm-hmm.
Married to Larry Townsend? Yeah. Her mother
Mr. Webb's wife.
Was the librarian. And then after she left, Mary Martin Bell was the librarian. And so my dad was always at school, at least for an hour after school. And I would just go into the library and I read biographies. You know, just learning about other people.
So, I think you told me about what was the most valuable lesson you learned from your parents?
I think 2 lessons. To always be proud of who you are. Not proud in the sense of prideful, but that you are glad of your heritage, you're glad of who you are. And to And because you're glad, then you learn, they taught me how to deal with challenges about that heritage. And I think one of the most important things that I will always remember my mom saying, and that I, by myself saying in different challenges with myself and my girls, is you can't change everything overnight. Some things you can't change. Don't get bogged down on it. Move on. Move on. That doesn't mean it's solved, but you can expend so much energy bemoaning the fact of what is. Like, I can't change my brown skin. And as my mother said, you don't need to change your brown skin. It's pretty. It's the way God made you. So if they're talking, you just move on. Let it go. Go on to the next thing. Yeah.
So how have you modeled this in raising your children?
Not as well as I would like to. My parents were, I think, more patient than I. But I have tried to instill in them respect for all heritages, not just heritage, every aspect of human life, sexuality, ability, disability. Respect life. Give people respect. And I'm pleased. And my parents were more patient. I found it hard to be patient when sometimes my children, it took them a while to get the message. And but one thing that I always did, which my parents did not do verbally, but I have always expressed my affection for the girls with words and deeds. But I knew without a shadow of a doubt that my parents loved me unconditionally. But it was rare for them to say the words, "I love you." And I don't think that's rare for my generation. And I didn't miss it because they did so many things that were so good that, I mean, you wouldn't do that if you didn't love somebody. I knew that. I mean, we were not rich, but in a sense we were privileged, my brothers and me, because both my parents had degrees, they had teaching jobs, and that was, it was a different economic lifestyle when you had that income. But they were very, they never talked about income. And they never, ever made a show of anything. If anything, they tried to downplay everything because they said it wasn't important. I think that thing about your own children is respect for others, and developing a relationship with God, and trying to let my actions speak for that more than words, because I think many young people are turned away from organized religion because of the rules, the expectations. I think that's especially true now. They see so much that appears to be hypocrisy, and I get that. But we always took them to church. Had a big youth group, which was a really good thing for them, because even at their most rebellious, they always, without saying you have to, they went to youth group. And to me, that spoke to the power of the leaders and the way they interacted with the kids. That they might disagree with Mama about something, but they wanted to go to youth group. As it turned out, Laura has not been an organized church person. But in the last, especially 5 years, her spiritual life has just blossomed through bad times. And sometimes that's what it takes. Lindsay, on the other hand, has been active in organized religion since she was married. And what's so interesting about it is, and her boys too, what's so interesting about it is that the church she attends now is certainly not my first choice, but it doesn't have to be my first choice because it's her. And so faith, faith.
So how did you learn traditions and customs, and how have you kept them alive, especially with your children and grandchildren?
Well, if you're talking about family traditions, when the girls were little, we always went to, when I was growing up, we always went to Grandmother Smith's house for a reunion in the summer, because the aunts and uncles who lived away, one was in Rhode Island, one was in D.C., when they came home, they were like royalty. You know, everybody entertained at your house, and then everybody got together at Grandma's house, and all the kids were sent to the yard because they had a big yard and a mulberry tree. And whatever you did out there, you better be nice and don't be disturbing the grown-ups inside, except when it's time to eat. For us, we always tried to go, for Jim and me, we tried to go to the Person County Epps family reunion, which I said was in August, which also, weirdly, is August 16th, which is Laura's birthday. And when she was little, that was fine. But when it came her birthday, you know, we either had to do birthday party ahead of time or later time, because that did not qualify for a birthday party for a little girl growing up. And we've done that sporadically. We've done it sporadically for years and years, but as the girls got older, you know, work, their families, whatever, the Smith family used to, we had the reunions for a long time, and after Granddaddy died, then, and Grandmother was in Durham at a retirement home, then we had it at Uncle Joe's house. And or then when he owned a hotel, we would have it at that hotel, and people, you know, would just get a room and stay and do all of that. But our get-togethers have become less frequent as family members have decreased. We did have, I guess it was about 10 years ago, the Smiths, I invited here, and they had to, you know, find their own place to stay, and then they came here for dessert on Friday night, and then we had a caterer bring food in on Saturday, and it was fun, you know, kids of all ages, and we were trying to do it this year, but somebody was graduating from college in Europe, and about half the family was going to that. So, and other people said it's too hot to do it, and they wanted to go back to Robinson County.
Right.
And they said it's too hot in the summer. So,
We don't know.
other traditions, Thanksgiving was never a big holiday at my parents' house. I mean, we had a turkey, but we didn't have like a table laden with food. We had like a regular meal and maybe an extra dessert. And my dad and brothers would always go out and hunt, and then be back for Thanksgiving dinner by like about 4 o'clock. And then this was before we were married, and then at Christmas time, just the 3 children, my parents, and we had Santa Claus came, and then a couple of days after Christmas, we would go up to see my dad's family. And of course the weather could be iffy up there, and I remember the roads weren't paved off the main highway, and I remember there were 2 spots that your car could get stuck. And you know, it's usually like the 27th of December and it's cold. And I remember how he had to walk about probably a mile to his dad's house, and they got a mule and brought it out to get the car out of the ruts in the road. And sometimes it snowed up there after Christmas, so it was real different. Easter, we usually got together with my mom's family, and sometimes on Highway 301, where that cemetery is that's near Robinson Tech, there was a big roadside park with tables, picnic tables, and so the adults would do a big Easter egg hunt there and bring potluck, and that would be like in the afternoon. I think they probably disbanded that when the children started fighting over who got how many eggs.
do you consider yourself closer to your Sappony side of the family or your Lumbee side of the family?
That's a hard question. I love both my parents, and they were fine examples of human beings, and they were different, as I've mentioned before. Both were educators. My dad was 10 or 11 years older than my mother. He was perfectly happy to be at home or in the woods walking with his dogs. Before my brothers were born, he had a couple horses. And Laura wanted a horse, and he said, well, I'll just get her one. And I said, no, you won't. We can't afford to board a horse in Raleigh. No, thank you. But my mom was very extroverted and very, both were very well mannered, spoke well. Were what I call real Christians, in that both of them, that they base their Christianity on love, and love is both a verb and an action, word and an action, and they did more actions than they did talking. They did things for people. Lumbees, for me, strengths of the Lumbee include an understanding in quest for education. It's changed so much since 1970. I mean, it's just changed. Still not changed enough. More active in advocacy, advocating for their own well-being and the people they care about, sometimes to their detriment. I think one of the things that dismays me about the Lumbees is that there's always a conversation or an argument over what's good for the Lumbee people. You would think it would be pretty simple. There's also still conversations about our heritage that are often upsetting to younger people. Like last weekend, my niece told me, she's a little bit more fair than you, but she has dark hair. She said that kids had told her that she wasn't Lumbee because she was that skin color, that she was white. Her dad's white. And I said, what'd you say? And she said, I just told him to shut up. And I'm like, well, that's one way to do it, but you're probably not going to change anybody's mind like that. For the Sappony, as I've mentioned before, I don't think there's an Indian community anywhere that's as closely knit as they are. They respect their elders more. My observation, both in word and deed. I never heard a Sappony child who lived up there all the time sass their parent. I have relatives in Robeson County who stood in their mother's face and called her up. And the mother didn't do anything. And I'm just like, But Sappony they laugh a lot. I think one of the big things about them is that they have always shown their emotions, men and women. If it's happy, they'll do you some belly laughs. Or if you're not a big laugher, you'll get that little sparkle in the eye. If it's sad, a man will cry just as quickly as a woman. I know that. I've lived with it. Both my brothers, my dad, my uncles, and I think that's a wonderful attribute, that whatever we feel, there should be an appropriate way to express it. As I mentioned before, the Sappony growing up in my generation there were no atheists. If they did, they hid it, and I don't think they would. I don't know about the young people. I don't know many young people, because, as I said, they live in town, or they're so much younger that they have their babies, and I don't even know which cousin is their mother. So it's just sort of a different. There are different locations, there are different numbers. There's different ways to make a living. At one time everybody was a farmer or tenant farmer. All that's changed. A lot of that's changed in Robeson, but it hasn't there. Old people now are not farming. The few farmers left are big time farmers, combined farms. I think both have a lot of strengths. And I like to think I'm a combination of the best of both. How's that? Silly me.
So you were involved in the early creation of Triangle Native American Society.
Uh-huh.
How did that come about, and why is that so important?
Have you talked to Betty Oxendine, madam?
Yes.
Have you interviewed
Yes.
her? Oh, good. Well, what she said is the truth, because she was the one who started it. It was interesting because I remember Betty saying, when they were talking about the name, that she wanted it to be society because it was going to be, she thought it should focus more on social things rather than, get-togethers and whatever. And that we were not going to be like running programs. We didn't have time to do that. We didn't have any money. And so that's what I remember. That we did some interesting things. We co-sponsored an art exhibit at the Art Museum on Duke campus. What is his name? I can't remember. Anyway, it was a traveling exhibit. A friend of mine is white, but she had become acquainted with a bunch of Native American artists in her travels with her husband. Her husband was a professor at State, and had met a bunch of Western artists and upstate New York. And so there was an exhibit that could be arranged, and it was done at Duke, and it was sponsored by Triangle, partly, and had a lot of attendance. That was one thing. And through this same woman, some benefactor set up a scholarship that was for American Indians who were going, I think it was in the health field, and it was administered by, I can't think of the foundation name, but it was in the Triangle. That was one, and then there was another one that was out of Durham. I've forgotten the names of them. I mean, they weren't big scholarships, but, you know. I think they ended up doing some socials. I think I remember we went to some socials. There were not, I don't think, a lot of couples that had really young children. I mean, you know, I didn't see most of those people except when we had meetings. Because that was during the time when, you know, I was on the Wake County Arts Council, I was on the North Carolina, what did my brother call it? Civil Liberties Union Board. I was on boards all over. So was Betty. She was very active, as she probably told you, in the Democratic Party. Did she tell you that? Did she tell you about the time that she was the president of the Wake County Democratic Women? Okay, it was the year when it turned out that Clinton was running. Okay, I mean, he was a candidate.
Right.
So Betty was the president of the chapter, and at that time they always had a big breakfast on a Saturday. It was like a weekend event, and so Betty made sure that for the first time at the head table, she was the Indian president. We had black people, I was the chaplain, and there were white people. And she had whoever Miss North Carolina was at the time to come and sing and all that. And people said that that was the first time they had ever seen such a diverse head table and participation at that event. And so Betty had communication with Mrs. Clinton afterwards, and I think she might have even gone to the White House, but it was just You know, one of those times when you have the chance to do something a little bit differently.
Right. So what do you think is the most pressing need for, this is a tough one actually. Not really a tough one, but because you're not really living in an Indian community here, so
Right.
I would typically ask pressing need for the Triangle Native community, or pressing need for the Lundy
Right.
community, or pressing need
I
for
will
the
give you
Stone
my
community.
impression for the whole state
Okay.
overall.
Or we can just say for the Indian community as a whole.
Right. To decrease the dropout rate, to increase our Indian level achievement, to have more women go into math and science. It's where the money is. That's all about education. I think the second priority, and maybe should tie with education, is healthcare. There are too many people who don't have insurance because they can't afford it. And with the propensity, the known facts about illnesses, diseases that our people get, diabetes, heart, blood pressure, I mean the basics. And that there should be either, well, certainly there should be some sliding scale medical care. And if you can't pay, then you just can't pay. Like for instance, when Lindsay was born, she was such a healthy looking baby, but every time she would drink milk, she would just go into fits, and of pain. And I felt like I spent half my life in the pediatrician's office with her. And so after about almost a year of that, he just said to me, I have tried everything I know. None of it has lasting value. So he said, I'm going to have you take her to the Duke Pediatric Allergy Department. So we go over there, Jim and I take her, and this lady comes in, and she speaks in a very heavy Germanic accent, and asks the usual questions. And she leaves the room momentarily, and she comes back and she said, oh, Mrs. Brooker, I forgot to ask you probably the most important question. I'm like, okay. She said, may I ask you a personal question? All right. She said, what is your ethnic heritage? And I said, American Indian. And she said, I think I know what it is, but I will let you know after we do the test. And of course, what she came back with was lactose intolerance. And she said, you know, your people, this is a common problem. And we know why. But she said, too many people don't know about this. And they've done what you did. You keep giving the baby milk because you want it to grow. Ice cream. And just, I mean, basically, some basic stuff at a a cost that people can afford, with providers who are sensitive to the fact that many people don't have an education or the money, and so they have to be culturally sensitive. When my mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, she was treated at Memorial in Chapel Hill, and she had had surgery. Anyway, she was in the hospital and not doing well. And Jim and I and the children were at Emerald Isle, and brother called me and said, Mom's not doing well. And I said, okay, well, I'll be coming up. And I called Cam and I drove up to Chapel Hill. And she was very ill. So we're in the room with her when the doctor on call, whatever you call him, the one that sees people, came in. And he looked surprised. And so after before he examined Mommy, he said, trying to sort of whisper, he said, you all need to leave the room. And I'm like, what? And he said, you need to leave the room. And I'm like, why? And he said, she's very ill. I'm like, uh-huh. And he said, if she wakes up and she sees you all are here, then she's probably going to think she's as sick as she really is, or sicker. And that's not very good for the patient. And I'm like, well, no, you got it wrong. And he said, what? Cam's like, let's step outside the door. And he said, obviously you don't know much about Native people. He said, when most Native people go to the hospital, a family member not only goes to see them, they spend the night with them in the room. And you tell a Native they can't be in the room? He said, no. And the doctor's just like, well, that's not the way we do it here. And Cam said, well, that's the way we're going to do it. I'm like, oh, all right, well, have us a little fist fight here. And do you know, the doc tried to keep us from going into the room. So Cam sort of put his hand on his shoulder and he said, let me tell you something. You either clear the way for us to come in, or I will find the hospital administrator and I will find you out of the room, because we're going to be in there. And all that to say is my internist here said, doctors, he said, there's an art and a science to being a doctor, and you need both the medical knowledge and the understanding of who you're dealing with. And I'm assuming that we've gotten a lot of Indian doctors, haven't we?
Mm-hmm. Good bit.
What?
A good bit.
Is the Jimmy, what was his name? Locklear?
Mm-hmm.
Is he still in?
He's still in Raleigh.
Is he practicing?
I don't think so. I think he's retired now.
How can that be? I think we need more scholarships for Indian children to go to college.
So I have 2 more questions.
Okay.
Right. So they have to be long answers. I know you're from an interracial marriage.
Yes.
So your kids are half white, quarter Sappony, quarter lumpy.
Yes.
And your grandkids, I imagine, are
I don't know. I don't do the math.
like an eighth and a half of one parent and half of the other parent.
Right.
How are you instilling Indian identity in them?
I
And
started.
are you aware? Are you afraid of the 2 or 3 generations after them?
No, I'm not afraid. We started at a very early age with our Laura. From the time she could talk, we talked about the fact that there are different kinds of people, and that her daddy belonged to a group called white people, and that I belonged to American Indians, and that meant that she had both, and that both had really wonderful people in each group. Both had bad people in each group, and that meant that she was half and half, and that when she got older, there would come a time when she would probably be asked what her heritage was, her race. And I said, and you get to choose. You can put down Indian, you can put down, and of course later you could put down both, biracial. And that worked for a while. And when she was in the 5th grade, we were living over on Fairview Road, she came home one day from school, and she seemed distressed, and I'm like, what's going on, sweetie? And she said, well, my teacher told me that I couldn't be a real Indian. And I'm like, and why did he say that? She said, well, we're talking about Indians in North Carolina. And he said that no Indians live in our zip code. And this man was the president of the Wake County Teachers Association. Yeah. So I just said to her, well, sweetie, it's not often that this kind of thing happens, but sometimes a teacher doesn't have the truth. And so, don't worry about it. I'm going to go and speak to your teacher, and everything will be fine. You do live here, and you are Indian. So I went to talk to the teacher, and he just said, well, Lumpies are not. I'm like, don't go any further. Don't talk to me about federal recognition. Don't talk to me about your preconceived ideas. And especially don't talk to me about income and how we can't live in this zip code. I said, we've been here several years in this zip code. And I said, on the ethnicity, I said, my birth certificate says American Indian. Her dad is white. Now what is that? And so yes, we're right in the neighborhood, in the school. I said, your school is one of the reasons we chose this. And he started to, give me more arguments. And I said, here's the way it is. You're not the authority. And I said, I will be speaking to your principal. Because nobody is going to tell my child what they are? Nobody. I said, she should be proud of both sides of her heritage. And that's the approach we always took. There's, yes, one's one, one's the other, there's good in both. Be proud of both. And we got the same thing with Lindsay. Years later, by this time, they had changed the law. At one time it was state law, I don't remember. Was it the dad's ethnicity that was the one that was put down, or the mother's? At one time there was one, it was one or the other.
I think it was probably up to the parents' side when they're enrolling their kids.
Enrolling their kids? I'm not talking about tribal identity. I'm talking
about when you went to enroll your kids in school, you had to designate what their race was. Whoever was going, and I don't think it was really by the father or the mother. I think it was when your parent was enrolling their kid.
It was specified which for a long time. And whatever that rule was, it was switched, the law, so that you had a choice. And yeah, okay. Craziness. But now, on just about everything, there's spaces for biracial, whatever. I think sometimes we lose people in the count when it's that general.
Right.
I think.
Yeah. So what are you most proud of, and what would you consider is your biggest achievement?
I'm most proud of a long and happy marriage that produced these beautiful kids and subsequently the grandchildren. Very, very proud. I'm proud of the advocacy work that I have done for our people, and particularly for our Indian women and girls. It just thrills me to see women going into so many different careers than were even open when I got out of college. That was a long time ago. I'm proud of the service that I've given in the communities, volunteer. I enjoyed I became a lay minister within the Methodist Church, and that has just been a blessing, a gift for me. But I hope that it has been of service to others. And the lay ministry that I have done mostly is to visit people who are not able to come to church anymore from their homes, or who are in retirement homes or nursing facilities. And because of their health status, I didn't know many of them, or hardly any of them, after I got through training. And so one of my friends said, well, I was going up to Mars Hill. There's a really nice residential facility up there, and they said, "Do you want me to go with you?" And I'm thinking, yes, but I'm not. I need, if I want to do this, this is a part of learning how to do it. And it's just, I know I got a whole lot more out of it than I gave. But what I did basically was take flowers from my garden to everybody and just chat. And then I think, what was it, a blessing or a contribution? Did you ask about?
Achievement.
Achievement. I think getting the book done, which was a joint effort with Jim, my brothers, a woman I knew met in Hilton Head who lives in Canada was the editor. Just different pieces of my world came together to do that. And in fact, last Saturday when my niece and nephew were here, well, go back to 2017 when it came out, and I was invited to speak at UNCP for National Women's History Month. And so my niece and her mother and this child who's now 14 all showed up, from Saddle Tree. And the little girl who was our old Lena said, "Aunt Lena, my mother says that I cannot read your book now, and it makes me mad." And she said, "Do you think I can read your book?" And I said, "No, not if your mama says not." And I said, "Actually, I think by the time you're, like in the 8th grade, that'll be a good time." So I'd forgotten about this. So they come in the door Friday night at 11 o'clock. "Aunt Lena, I have a question for you. I have finished the 8th grade. May I read your book now?" So I said, yes. So I wrote her a message and gave her a book before she left. But yeah, it was a sort of a joint effort of a lot of people. But I cannot tell you, when I get text or letters or phone calls from people who have read the book and they say, "Oh, thank you for writing this. So much of this occurred where in my life, or I had no idea." And I've had it from all ethnic groups, all ages. And as I said in the book, it's to help people know who we are and to affirm that we have always been strong and resilient. And one other thing that I'm very proud of is I taught off and on in different places for 7 years, all different places, different kinds of students. And occasionally I will get a letter from one of my past students thanking me for being their teacher. And the last one I got came in an envelope that was addressed to the church that I attend. And the administrative assistant called and she says, "Lena, there's a brown manila envelope up here, and it's from Boston, And she said, there's a handwritten note that says, do not open unless you are the addressee. And I'm like, okay, I don't know. I said, there's probably some advertisement for a book or something. So I wait several days to go by and pick it up. And I sit down finally and open it. And it was a letter from, it was two typewritten pages. Typewritten. And it was from one of my students when I taught the 1 year in Chevy Chase, Maryland. And then I got married at the end of that year. And he wrote me this beautiful letter about something about his background that I didn't know about. His dad grew up in the cornfields of Kansas or something and went to Europe and met a German woman and met her, and they lived there. I've forgotten what he said his dad did. But his parents had always been very strict and involved in who his teacher was. And he just talked about how shy he had been, as a student, and all the neat things we did. And he said, like, we had to have we had some kind of assembly around Thanksgiving, and each class was supposed to sing 2 songs, like for the class in the auditorium. So he said, and I will never forget that you taught us, "This land is my land." What was that, a Carpenter's or somebody's song? And the Carolina Fight song. And so I'm serious, I'm a Tar Heel born. And so he said, and I will never forget, everybody, the parents are looking around like, oh, what? But I told him, what this was. He said, we kids thought that was the neatest thing, to sing that kind of song. And then at the end of the year, I wrote them a letter and invited them, told them how much I'd enjoyed. But things like that, for teachers, you don't know if you've made an impact or not. And so, oh, by the way, he went to William and Mary to college, was all South track, and became a neurosurgeon. And the only reason I heard from him was he said that he and his wife were going to move to a smaller home, and he found this box of it from his childhood, and he was going through it. And so here is Miss Epps in Chevy Chase.
That's so cool.
They were a cool class. So any more questions?
I think that's it. I just want to thank you for taking the time and allowing us to conduct this oral history interview. And I look forward to other people to get to see it.